You know, there are moments in life when everything changes in an instant. When the mask we wear slips away, and the truth we've been hiding for years comes flooding back. This is a story about one of those moments. A story about a man who tried to bury his past, but found that some things can never stay buried forever. It was a Thursday night in Chicago, the kind of cold, crisp evening where your breath forms little clouds in the air. Inside the elite combat academy, the fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting their harsh white glow across the polished training mats. Most of the students had already gone home. The place should have been empty, quiet, peaceful. But not tonight. Marcus Thompson pushed his mop across the floor with the same steady rhythm he'd used for the past 3 weeks. Back and forth. Back and forth. At 42 years old, his hands were weathered but strong. His movements were careful, methodical. He'd learned to make himself invisible in places like this. Arrive after everyone leaves. Clean in silence. Collect your paycheck. Go home to your daughter. Keep your head down. Stay forgotten. That's how Marcus had survived for 20 years. By becoming nobody. By erasing the man he used to be. But what nobody knew, not the gym owner, not the students, not even his teenage daughter, was that this humble man mopping their floors had once been someone extraordinary. Someone legendary. Someone who had walked away from glory and disappeared into the shadows of ordinary life. Tonight, that secret was about to come crashing back into the light. "Hey, you there with the mop." The voice cut through the quiet like a knife. Loud, arrogant, demanding attention. Marcus looked up slowly. His heart sank. The advanced class was still there. 8 students in their GI uniforms, sweating and breathing hard from their drills. And at the center of it all stood Brandon Cole, the Academy's star instructor. His black belt hung prominently around his waist like a badge of authority. His chest was puffed out, his chin raised high. Everything about his posture screamed superiority. "How about a quick demonstration?" Brandon called out, a smirk spreading across his face. "I bet you've never seen a real fight in your life, right?" Marcus felt that familiar tightness in his chest. The same feeling he got whenever someone looked at him and saw nothing but a janitor. Nothing but someone beneath them. He'd experienced it 1,000 times since he left his old life behind. Usually, he just swallowed it down and moved on. "I don't want to interrupt your class, sir," Marcus replied calmly, returning his attention to the stubborn stain he'd been working on. "Just finishing my work so you can continue training." Brandon's laugh echoed through the gym. It was theatrical, exaggerated, performed for his audience. "Everyone, look at this. The guy's too scared to even step on the mat." Some of the students laughed. Nervous, uncomfortable laughter. The kind that people make when they know something isn't right, but don't have the courage to speak up. Marcus could see it in their faces. A few of them shifting their weight, looking away, clearly uncomfortable with what their instructor was doing. But Brandon didn't notice, or maybe he didn't care. "Come on, buddy," Brandon continued, walking toward Marcus with that swagger. That entitled, arrogant swagger that Marcus had seen so many times before in his life. "Just one demonstration. I'm willing to bet you don't even know how to hold a proper guard. How about showing my students the difference between someone who trains seriously and someone who just pushes a broom around?" Each word was like a small needle, pricking at something deep inside Marcus. Something he'd kept locked away for 2 decades. Something dangerous. You see, what Brandon didn't know, what nobody in that gym could possibly know, was that Marcus Thompson had spent 20 years trying to forget who he really was. 20 years since he walked away from the ring after a tragedy that shattered his entire world. 20 years keeping a secret so painful that he'd never even told his own daughter. His real name was Marcus Silent Thunder Thompson, 5-time world mixed martial arts champion. Undefeated, unstoppable, A legend. But legends come with a price. Marcus closed his eyes for just a moment, and he was back there. Back in that gym in Miami, 20 years ago. He could hear the crowd shouting, could feel the pressure building in his chest, could hear the racist taunts from the audience, comments about how a fighter who looked like him didn't belong in a championship ring. He'd won that night, won by knockout, but the rage those comments had ignited in him, it didn't just disappear. It followed him into the next sparring session, into the ring with his best friend and training partner, Anthony Hammer Rodriguez. The combination Marcus threw that day was too hard, too fast, too fueled by anger he hadn't properly processed. Anthony fell, hit his head at just the wrong angle, and never woke up. The investigation called it an accident. Everyone told Marcus it wasn't his fault, but Marcus knew the truth. He'd lost control, and his best friend paid with his life. That wasn't even the only loss that drove Marcus away from fighting. His younger sister, Keisha, beautiful, brave, brilliant Keisha, was just 17 when she died, caught in the crossfire of a police confrontation in their neighborhood. Marcus was competing in Japan when he got the news. Another person he loved, lost while he chased glory in distant places. So he'd made a vow, never fight again. Never risk losing control. Never let that darkness inside him hurt anyone else. For 20 years, he'd kept that promise. 20 years of simple jobs, simple life, simple existence. He became invisible, forgettable, safe. But some promises are made to be broken when human dignity is at stake. So, Janitor, Brandon sneered, now standing just a few feet away. How about demonstrating a basic guard for my students? Or is that too complex for someone who only knows how to handle cleaning equipment? More laughter rippled through the gym. Marcus remained still, his eyes closed, breathing slowly. He was trying to stay calm, trying to remember why he'd walked away from all of this, trying to hold on to the peace he'd built for himself. "What's wrong?" Brandon taunted, starting to circle Marcus like a predator stalking wounded prey. "Are you frightened? Or are you just going to stand there like you do all day with your mop and bucket?" And then Brandon made his first critical mistake. He pushed Marcus, just lightly on the shoulder. A seemingly harmless gesture, really, but it carried all the weight of Brandon's arrogance, all his entitlement, all his belief that he was superior to the man standing before him. Marcus didn't move, not an inch. His feet stayed planted on the ground like ancient tree roots that had been there for 1,000 years. Brandon might as well have tried to push a concrete wall. The instructor's confident smile faltered just for a second, just long enough for a flicker of doubt to cross his face. "Interesting," Marcus murmured, more to himself than to anyone else. "It's been quite a while since someone tried to provoke me like this." There was something in Marcus's voice that changed everything. It wasn't angry. It wasn't threatening. It was the calm, the unsettling, frightening calm of someone who had walked through hell and come out the other side transformed. Someone who had faced demons that Brandon Cole couldn't even imagine. But Brandon couldn't read the signs. Wounded pride is a powerful drug. It makes you blind to danger. "Did you hear that, everyone?" Brandon called out to his students. "He thinks it's interesting. How about we demonstrate the difference between thinking and actually knowing?" That's when something shifted in the room. The air itself seemed to change, to become heavier, charged with electricity before a lightning strike. And that's when she spoke up. "Instructor Brandon," came a firm female voice. "May I ask why you consider it necessary to humiliate someone simply doing their job?" Everyone turned. The speaker was Lisa Chun, a 22-year-old student with her dark hair pulled back in a tight ponytail. She was a purple belt in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu and a graduate student in sports psychology. For 2 years, She'd been documenting cases of discrimination in athletics for her thesis. What she was witnessing right now, this was more than just academic material. This was wrong, and she couldn't stay silent. The silence that followed was deafening. Brandon slowly turned toward Lisa, his eyes narrowing. "Excuse me, Lisa, but who's teaching this class?" "You are," she replied, her voice steady despite the fear Marcus could see in her eyes. "But that shouldn't include racial humiliation disguised as technical demonstration." Several students exchanged nervous glances. Nobody had ever challenged Brandon like this before. "Racial?" Brandon forced a laugh. "This has nothing to do with race. It's about respecting martial arts and understanding your place." Marcus opened his eyes slowly. There was something about this young woman, her courage, her refusal to accept injustice silently, that reminded him so much of Keisha. His sister had that same fire, that same determination to stand up for what was right, no matter the cost. Watching Lisa now, standing up to authority despite her fear, Marcus felt something crack inside the walls he'd built around himself. For 20 years, he'd carried the weight of guilt for 2 deaths. For 20 years, he'd hidden from who he was, believing that his strength only brought destruction. But maybe true strength wasn't about fighting. Maybe it was about standing up for those who needed protection, about teaching rather than destroying, about character rather than violence. "Lisa," Brandon said in a dangerously low voice, "if you can't respect my teaching methods, perhaps you should find another gym. There are places better suited to people with your mentality." The threat hung in the air like poison. Lisa felt a chill run down her spine, but she didn't back down. "My membership is paid, sir, and I believe everyone here deserves a learning environment based on mutual respect, not humiliation." And that's when Marcus did something that surprised everyone in that room. He smiled. Not a nervous smile, not a submissive smile, but the slow, calculated smile of someone who had just found a real reason, to stop hiding. "Brandon," Marcus said, his voice carrying a quiet authority that made every single person in that gym turn to look at him. The janitor who'd been invisible just moments ago suddenly commanded the entire room's attention with nothing but his voice. "The young woman is correct. This isn't about martial arts. It's about you trying to feel important by diminishing others." Brandon spun around, his face flushing red with indignation. "How dare you lecture me about martial arts? You don't even know what a proper training hall is." Marcus set down his mop. He set down his bucket, and then he took one step forward. It was just one step, but everything changed. His shoulders straightened, his center of gravity lowered, almost imperceptibly. His feet positioned themselves in a stance that anyone with real experience would instantly recognize as perfect, flawless, the stance of a master. Lisa Chun felt goosebumps rise on her arms. She'd spent 2 years studying sports biomechanics, analyzing hundreds of hours of footage of elite fighters. What she'd just witnessed was a transformation, from ordinary man to something else entirely. Something dangerous, something beautiful, like watching a sleeping tiger open its eyes. "Actually," Marcus said calmly, "I know exactly what a training hall is, and I know this place stopped being one a long time ago." Brandon felt a chill run down his spine. Every instinct in his body was suddenly screaming at him to back down, to apologize, to walk away. But his pride wouldn't let him. Not in front of his students. Not after he'd gone this far. "Enough talking," Brandon growled, dropping into his favorite fighting stance. Feet shoulder-width apart. Fists at chest level. Weight slightly forward. The stance he'd used to intimidate hundreds of beginners over the years. "I'll teach you respect the hard way." Marcus closed his eyes briefly. Just for a moment. And in that moment, 22 years of muscle memory came flooding back. Every technique perfected over decades of training. Every victory earned in the world's most brutal rings. Every lesson learned from the greatest fighters who ever lived. When Marcus opened his eyes again, Brandon Cole wasn't looking at a janitor anymore. He was staring directly into the eyes of Silent Thunder Thompson, 5-time world mixed martial arts champion. Legend. Last chance to apologize, Marcus offered graciously, his voice soft but carrying the weight of absolute certainty. To her, to your students, and to restore this place as a genuine learning environment. Brandon laughed, but the sound came out nervous, forced. Apologize? Man, you'll be begging forgiveness when you're on your back. What Brandon couldn't see, what he couldn't possibly understand, was that in those few seconds, Marcus had already analyzed everything about him. The high guard that left his body exposed, the tendency to retreat with his right leg first, the micro-movements in his shoulders that telegraphed every punch before it even began. 22 years away from professional rings hadn't erased decades of refined technical analysis. Marcus could see every weakness, every pattern, every predictable movement. The students formed a circle around them now, sensing that something extraordinary was about to happen. The air itself seemed to vibrate with tension. Still waiting, Brandon sneered, bouncing slightly on his feet. Or are you just going to stand there like a statue? And then Marcus moved. Not dramatically, not with any show of force. Just a subtle repositioning of his feet. A slight lowering of his center of gravity. His shoulders relaxing into a perfectly horizontal line. But to anyone who knew what to look for, the transformation was instantaneous and terrifying. Lisa Chen couldn't breathe. During her 2 years of research, she'd analyzed countless hours of elite fighter footage. What she just witnessed was the transition from man to predator. Subtle as a whisper, devastating as an avalanche. Brandon felt sweat beginning to form on his forehead, though he didn't understand why. And then he attacked. His first punch was technically sound. A fast, accurate jab executed exactly as the textbooks taught. The kind of strike that worked against 99% of the people he'd ever sparred with. But Marcus Thompson wasn't in that 99%. The movement was so fast, so impossibly fluid, that half the people watching couldn't even process what happened. Marcus simply wasn't where Brandon's fist was aimed. His body had flowed to the side, like water moving around stone. And suddenly Brandon was off balance, his arm extended into empty air, completely exposed. Nice attempt, Marcus commented softly, already repositioned and perfectly balanced. Clean technique, adequate speed, but you telegraphed it with your right shoulder. Brandon spun wildly, trying to locate his opponent. How had someone moved that fast? Beginner's luck, he muttered, launching another combination. Jab, cross, hook. 3 punches linked together with precision from thousands of repetitions. His signature sequence, the combination he used to finish sparring sessions and impress newcomers. Again, Marcus simply wasn't there. This time, Lisa managed to follow the movement. Marcus had lowered himself slightly, allowing the jab to pass over his head by mere inches. The cross found only air as he leaned back in an impossible curve, his spine bending like bamboo in the wind. And when Brandon threw the hook with all his force, Marcus took one small step back, causing the fist to miss his chin by millimeters. Interesting combination, Marcus observed, his breathing still completely even, completely calm. Works well against stationary opponents, but you're completely exposing your left side after the hook. Brandon was sweating now. Really sweating. This wasn't normal. He'd landed thousands of punches in his life. Thousands. And now he couldn't land a single one on a man who supposedly never fought before. Stop dancing and fight, Brandon shouted, frustration and confusion mixing in his voice. That's when Marcus decided the demonstration had continued long enough. Brandon launched his third attack, A desperate, wild combination of punches and kicks, throwing everything he had. And once more, every strike found nothing but air. But this time, something different happened. When Brandon recovered from his barrage of missed attacks, breathing hard, off balance, Marcus was suddenly closer. Much closer. "How?" Brandon whispered, his voice barely audible. He'd completely lost control of the distance between them. "Brandon," Marcus said softly, now standing just an arm's length away, "would you like to know the difference between someone who learned fighting in gyms and someone who learned in professional rings?" Before Brandon could respond, before he could process what was happening, Marcus did something that defied everything those people thought they knew about physics and power. Without appearing to use any force, without any sudden or aggressive movements, he simply reached out and touched Brandon's chest with the palm of his right hand. And Brandon flew. He wasn't pushed. He wasn't knocked down. He was propelled, literally propelled backward, as if struck by an invisible wave of pure force. His feet left the ground. He traveled nearly 6 feet through the air, and he landed on his back with an impact that made every single person in that gym gasp out loud. The silence that followed was absolute. Complete. You could have heard a pin drop. Brandon lay on the floor, staring up at the ceiling, his mind trying desperately to process what had just happened. There was no pain, just the overwhelming, irresistible force of someone operating on a level completely different from anything he'd ever experienced in his life. That's impossible," he whispered. Lisa Chun had her phone out now, her fingers trembling as she typed frantically into the search bar. Her instincts had been right. She knew she'd seen those movements before, knew that level of mastery was legendary. And then she found it. "You don't understand who he is, do you?" Lisa said, her voice barely above a whisper. Everyone turned to look at her. On her phone screen were dozens of articles, photographs, and videos. Championship belts. Trophy presentations. A younger man with the same face, the same eyes, standing in rings around the world. Marcus Thompson. Lisa read aloud, her voice shaking. Also known as Silent Thunder. 5-time world mixed martial arts champion. Considered one of the greatest technical fighters in history. Retired undefeated after a 22-year career, following an accident that resulted in his training partner's death. The words hit the room like a bomb. Brandon's face went completely pale as the reality crashed down on him like a tidal wave. He had challenged a living martial arts legend. He had publicly humiliated someone who could have knocked him unconscious with a casual movement. Five-time world champion? Brandon stammered, all his arrogance evaporating in an instant. Marcus nodded slowly. "I retired at 29. Since then, I've worked whatever jobs I could find. Cleaning, maintenance, simple work. Simple life. No spotlight, no cameras, no need to prove anything to anyone." The transformation in Brandon was instantaneous and painful to watch. The arrogant instructor was gone, completely gone, replaced by someone who finally understood the magnitude of his ignorance and his cruelty. But Marcus wasn't finished, because the real lesson, the one that would cut deeper than any physical blow, was still to come. And that lesson would change everything. You know what the hardest punches are? They're not the ones that hit your body. They're the ones that hit your soul. The ones that force you to look in the mirror and see who you really are. Brandon Cole was about to receive one of those punches, and it would hurt far more than being thrown across the room. Brandon stood up slowly, his legs still trembling beneath him. His students watched in stunned silence, their eyes moving between their instructor and the janitor who had just revealed himself to be a living legend. The entire atmosphere of the gym had shifted. It was like watching reality itself bend and reshape before their eyes. I didn't know," Brandon whispered, his voice cracking with shame. If you had known," Marcus interrupted gently, his voice still calm, but carrying a weight that made everyone lean in to listen. "Would you have treated me with respect?" Brandon opened his mouth to answer, but Marcus wasn't finished. "But would you still have humiliated some other janitor? Another worker without credentials to defend themselves? Someone who didn't have 5 championship belts hidden in their past?" The question hung in the air like smoke. Heavy, suffocating, unavoidable. And that's when Brandon realized something that made his stomach turn. Marcus had put his finger on the real problem. It wasn't that Brandon hadn't known who Marcus was. It was that Brandon believed he had the right to humiliate anyone he perceived as beneath him. The issue wasn't ignorance about credentials. It was the fundamental arrogance that made him think a person's profession determined their worth. Marcus took a step closer, and Brandon instinctively flinched. Not from fear of being hit, but from the moral weight of what was being revealed about his own character. "You see, Brandon," Marcus continued, his voice taking on the tone of a teacher now, someone imparting a lesson that needed to be learned. "Martial arts was supposed to teach you humility, discipline, respect, but somewhere along the way, you turned your belt into a weapon for your ego instead of a symbol of your commitment to growth." Lisa Chun stepped forward, her voice firm and clear. "Instructor Brandon, for 2 years I've trained at this academy out of respect for your experience. But what I witnessed today wasn't teaching. It was bullying disguised as instruction." Other students began to murmur in agreement. The revelation about Marcus had completely transformed their perspective. They'd watched their instructor mock and belittle a man who could have destroyed him without breaking a sweat. But more importantly, they'd watched that same man show restraint, control, and grace under pressure. One of the younger students, a teenage boy with his white belt still crisp and new, spoke up hesitantly. "Sensei Brandon, why didn't you just apologize when he asked you to? Out of the mouths of babes, as they say. Sometimes the simplest questions cut the deepest." Brandon looked around at the faces of his students. Really looked at them. Some seemed disappointed in him. Others looked confused, like children who just discovered their parents weren't infallible. A few were angry, their arms crossed, their jaws set. He was losing them. Right here, right now, he was losing their respect. "Marcus," Brandon said finally, his voice heavy with genuine shame, "I sincerely apologize. To you, to Lisa, to everyone here. I have no excuse for my behavior. What I did was wrong. What I said was wrong. And I'm sorry." The apology hung in the air. It was real. You could hear it in Brandon's voice. The crack in his pride, the genuine remorse. But Marcus had been in enough fights, had lived enough life, to know that apologies were only the beginning. "Appreciated, Brandon," Marcus said with a small nod. "But apologies are only the first step. The question is, what are you going to do differently from now on?" Brandon looked around the room again, and this time he saw it with new eyes. He saw the young woman he tried to silence for speaking truth. He saw the students he'd been using as an audience for his ego. He saw the man he'd tried to humiliate based on nothing but his job and the color of his skin. "I'll change," Brandon promised, his voice barely above a whisper. "It'll take time, but I'll change. I have to." That's when Lisa asked the question that surprised everyone in the room, including Marcus himself. "Mr. Thompson," she said, her voice respectful but hopeful, "would you consider teaching again? Because I think we could all learn far more from someone who understands that true strength comes with responsibility." Marcus was quiet for a long moment. Teaching. The word brought back so many memories. Training sessions with Anthony. The gyms he'd worked in across the world. The young fighters he'd mentored before everything fell apart. He'd walked away from all of that, believing his hands only brought destruction. But maybe he'd been wrong. Maybe the very thing he'd been running from was exactly what these young people needed. A slow smile spread across Marcus's face. The first genuine smile anyone had seen from him that entire night. "Perhaps," he said thoughtfully, "but not to teach fighting techniques. To teach something far more important. That respect isn't earned with belts or titles, but with character." Lisa's eyes lit up. Several students nodded eagerly. Even Brandon, still processing his humiliation, seemed to recognize the wisdom in those words. "You know," Marcus continued, his voice taking on a reflective quality, "I spent 20 years running from who I was. 20 years believing that my strength was dangerous, that I was dangerous. I watched my best friend die because I lost control. I lost my sister while I was chasing glory halfway around the world. So I decided the safest thing to do was to become nobody. To hide." He looked around at the students, his eyes meeting each of theirs in turn. "But tonight, watching this young woman stand up for what's right even when it was scary, even when it might cost her something, that reminded me of something I'd forgotten. Strength isn't the problem. It's what you do with it that matters. My sister Keisha," Marcus said, his voice softening. "She was only 17 when she died, but she had more courage in her little finger than most people have in their whole body. She never stayed quiet when she saw injustice, never backed down when someone needed defending. And watching you tonight, Lisa, I saw her again. That same fire, that same refusal to let wrong go unchallenged." Lisa felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes. She'd spoken up tonight, not knowing how it would turn out, just knowing it was the right thing to do. Marcus turned back to Brandon. "You asked me earlier to show your students a demonstration, so here it is. The real lesson isn't about how to throw a punch or execute a technique. It's about recognizing that every person you meet, whether they're wearing a black belt or pushing a mop, has a story, has dignity, has value. And treating people with respect isn't something you do because they've earned it with credentials. It's something you do because that's what character looks like." Brandon nodded slowly, the weight of the lesson settling on his shoulders like a heavy coat. "I understand," Brandon said. "I really do. And I know just saying sorry isn't enough. Actions matter more than words." "Now you're learning," Marcus said with a slight smile. "That's a start." One of the older students, a woman in her 30s with a brown belt, raised her hand tentatively. "Mr. Thompson, can I ask you something?" "Of course." "You could have hurt him," she said, gesturing toward Brandon. "You could have really hurt him. Why didn't you?" It was a good question, an important question. Marcus thought for a moment before answering. Because hurting him wouldn't have taught him anything. It would have just made him a victim instead of giving him a chance to become better. Real strength isn't about domination. It's about control. Control over your own power, your own emotions, your own ego. The hardest thing I ever learned was that sometimes the strongest thing you can do is hold back. He paused, his eyes distant, remembering. When Anthony died, my training partner, my best friend, it was because I didn't have that control. I let anger and hurt and pressure turn me into something dangerous. And he paid the price. So I made a promise to myself. Never again. Never lose control again. Never let my strength become a weapon that hurts innocent people. For 20 years, I kept that promise by hiding, by becoming invisible. But tonight, I realized something. Control doesn't mean hiding. It means using your strength wisely, protecting instead of destroying, teaching instead of dominating. And that's what I did tonight. I used just enough force to make the point without causing harm. The students were completely silent now, absorbing every word. This wasn't the kind of lesson you could learn from a manual or a video. This was wisdom earned through pain, through loss, through decades of real experience. So yes, Marcus concluded, I could have hurt him, but what would that have solved? Instead, I gave all of you, a chance to learn something far more valuable than a fighting technique. I gave you a chance to see what character looks like under pressure. Lisa pulled out her phone again and looked at Marcus hopefully. Mr. Thompson, I know this is a lot to ask, but would you be willing to let me interview you for my thesis? This whole situation, the discrimination, the response, the lesson, it's exactly what my research is about. And I think your story could help so many people understand these dynamics better. Marcus considered for a moment, then nodded. Sure, if it helps people learn, I'm happy to share my story. But, he added with a gentle smile, you have to promise me one thing. What's that? That you keep speaking up when you see injustice. The world needs more people like you. People who aren't afraid to stand for what's right, even when it's uncomfortable. Lisa felt warmth spread through her chest. I promise. Brandon, who had been quiet for several minutes, processing everything, finally spoke again. Mr. Thompson, I know I don't deserve to ask you for anything after what I did, but would you be willing to teach me? Not fighting techniques, but what you talked about. Character, control, how to be better. Marcus looked at Brandon for a long moment. The instructor's eyes were red-rimmed, his shoulders slumped with genuine remorse. Pride was a hard thing to swallow, and Brandon was choking on it. But he was trying, and trying was a start. We'll see, Marcus said finally. Change isn't something that happens overnight, Brandon. It's something you have to work at every single day. You have to earn back the trust of these students. You have to prove through your actions, not just your words, that you've learned this lesson. And that takes time. I understand, Brandon said. And I'll do the work. I swear I will. Marcus nodded. Then maybe in time we can talk about it. As the students began to gather their things, the energy in the gym had completely transformed. What had started as a tense, ugly confrontation had become something else entirely. A teaching moment, a turning point, a chance for real growth. Lisa approached Marcus as he picked up his mop and bucket. You're really going back to cleaning? She asked, surprised. Marcus chuckled. I'm still the janitor here. At least for tonight. These floors won't clean themselves. But you're a 5-time world champion. And right now, I'm also a man with a job to finish. Marcus replied with a warm smile. There's no shame in honest work, Lisa. That's part of the lesson too. Your worth isn't determined by your title or your profession. It's determined by how you treat people and how you live your life. Lisa shook her head in amazement. You really are something else, Mr. Thompson. Just Marcus, he corrected gently. And thank you for speaking up tonight, for having courage when it mattered. As the students filed out of the gym one by one, several of them stopped to shake Marcus's hand or thank him quietly. Even the ones who'd laughed at Brandon's jokes earlier seemed ashamed now, recognizing their own complicity in what had happened. When the last student had left, it was just Marcus and Brandon in the gym. The silence stretched between them, not hostile, but heavy with everything that had happened. Marcus, Brandon said finally, I want you to know, this wasn't just about ignorance or having a bad day. You were right. I've been using my position to make myself feel superior. I've been treating people like they're beneath me because of their jobs, their backgrounds, their race. And that's on me. That's who I chose to be. Marcus stopped mopping and looked at Brandon directly. The fact that you can admit that, that's progress. Most people never get there. They make excuses, they blame circumstances, they convince themselves they're not really that bad. But you just looked in the mirror and told the truth about what you saw. That takes guts. It doesn't feel like guts, Brandon said bitterly. It feels like I'm finally seeing what everyone else already knew, that I've been a terrible teacher and a worse person. Maybe, Marcus said. But you know what? Every day is a new chance to be different. You can't change what you did today, but you can change what you do tomorrow, and the day after that, and the day after that. Eventually, those days add up, and maybe, if you keep at it, you'll look back one day and barely recognize the person you used to be. Brandon nodded slowly. Is that what happened to you? After your friend died, Marcus was quiet for a moment, leaning on his mop. Yeah, he said softly. That's exactly what happened. I had to completely rebuild myself. Had to figure out who I was when I wasn't fighting, when I wasn't winning, when I wasn't chasing glory. It was the hardest thing I've ever done. Harder than any fight in any ring. But it was also the most important thing I've ever done. How long did it take? I'm still working on it, Marcus admitted with a slight smile. 20 years later, and I'm still working on it. That's the thing about becoming better. It's not a destination. It's a journey that never really ends. Brandon absorbed this, then asked the question that had been weighing on him. Do you think I can really change? Or have I already gone too far? Marcus looked at the younger man. The arrogant instructor from an hour ago now looked small, uncertain, vulnerable. But there was something else there too. Something that looked like genuine desire to be better. I think, Marcus said carefully, that the fact you're even asking that question means you haven't gone too far. The people who are truly lost are the ones who don't think they need to change. You're not there. Not yet. But you're at a crossroads. And what you do next, not just tomorrow, but every day after that, that's what will determine the answer to your question. Brandon nodded, blinking back tears. Thank you. For not destroying me when you could have. For teaching me instead of just punishing me. You're welcome, Marcus said. Now go home. Think about what happened here tonight. And tomorrow, start being different. After Brandon left, Marcus finished cleaning the gym in silence. His mind was racing, processing everything that had happened. For 20 years, he'd been running from his past. For 20 years, he believed that the safest thing he could do was hide his strength, bury his skills, become nobody. But tonight had changed something fundamental. Tonight, he'd remembered that strength wasn't the problem. It was how you used it. And maybe, just maybe, the best way to honor Anthony's memory wasn't to hide forever. Maybe it was to teach others the lessons he'd learned the hard way. When Marcus finally locked up the gym and stepped out into the cold Chicago night, he felt lighter somehow. Like a weight he'd been carrying for 2 decades had finally begun to lift. He pulled out his phone and looked at a photo on his lock screen. His teenage daughter, smiling at the camera, full of life and joy. She looked so much like Keisha. Same smile, same fire in her eyes. Maybe it was time to tell her the truth about who her father used to be. About Silent Thunder. About the championships and the tragedy, and the long journey back to being human again. Maybe it was time to stop hiding. Marcus smiled to himself as he walked toward the bus stop. Tomorrow was going to be interesting. The Elite Combat Academy looked different now. The same building, the same mats, the same fluorescent lights. But the energy was completely transformed. Marcus Thompson stood at the front of a class, no longer wearing janitor's clothes, but a simple black GI. He was teaching a class on martial arts philosophy and advanced techniques. But more than that, he was teaching about character, about respect, about what it really means to be strong. Remember, he was saying to the 20 students gathered before him, the belt around your waist is not a weapon. It's not a tool for your ego. It's a reminder that you're a student first, always learning, always growing. The moment you think you've learned everything is the moment you stop growing. Lisa Chun sat in the front row, taking notes furiously. She'd become one of Marcus's most dedicated students, and her thesis on discrimination in athletics was already generating buzz in academic circles. The video she'd recorded that night had gone viral, not because it showed someone being humiliated, but because it showed what real teaching looked like, what real strength looked like. Brandon Cole had lost half his students in the week following the incident. The video, spreading across social media, had devastated his reputation in the martial arts community. He now taught at a much smaller gym across town, his classes limited to beginners, his arrogance replaced by a humility born of public shame. But Brandon was trying, really trying. He'd reached out to Marcus twice, asking for guidance, and Marcus had responded with patience and wisdom. Change was slow, but it was happening. After class, Lisa approached Marcus as he was organizing equipment. "Instructor Marcus, I wanted to thank you again for everything you've taught me." Marcus smiled warmly. "You don't need to keep thanking me, Lisa. You already had courage inside you. I just gave you a reason to use it." "No," Lisa insisted. "You taught me that true strength doesn't need to announce itself. It doesn't need to dominate or intimidate. It just is, and that's changed how I see everything." "Good," Marcus said. "That's what I hoped you'd learn." "My professor wants to meet you, by the way," Lisa added. "She's been following the case study I'm writing, and she thinks your story could be the basis for a whole new framework for understanding power dynamics in athletic environments." Marcus chuckled. "I'm just a guy who used to fight, and now cleans floors and teaches some classes. I don't know about frameworks." "You're more than that," Lisa said seriously. "You're proof that how we treat people, especially people we think are beneath us, says everything about our character. And right now, the world needs more people to learn that lesson." Marcus was quiet for a moment, then nodded. "All right, I'll meet with your professor. If my story can help people, then it's worth sharing." As Lisa left, Marcus stood alone in the gym, looking around at the space that had become his new home. He'd come here 3 months ago just looking for a job, a paycheck, a way to stay invisible. Instead, he'd found a purpose again. His phone buzzed. A text from his daughter. "Dad, some kids at school found that old video of you fighting. They're asking if it's really you. Should I tell them yes?" Marcus smiled and typed back. "Tell them yes. Tell them it's me. And tell them I'll answer any questions they have when I get home. No more secrets." He looked at his reflection in the gym's mirror. The same face he'd seen for 42 years, but somehow different now. The weight of guilt and shame that had pulled his shoulders down for 2 decades was lighter. Not gone. It would never be completely gone. Anthony and Keisha would always be with him, but the weight was bearable now. Purposeful, Marcus thought about Brandon, struggling to rebuild his reputation and his character. He thought about Lisa, finding her voice and using it to fight injustice. He thought about all the students who'd witnessed that night and learned something about respect they'd never forget. And he thought about himself, Marcus Silent Thunder Thompson, 5-time world champion, who'd spent 20 years trying to forget his power, only to learn that the real lesson was in how you used it. Sometimes justice arrives like a thunderstorm, loud, dramatic, impossible to ignore. But sometimes justice arrives quietly, like a gentle rain that slowly transforms the landscape over time. Marcus had learned that real change, lasting change, doesn't come from destruction. It comes from teaching, from patience, from showing people a better way through your actions, not your fists. He picked up his bag and turned off the lights in the gym. As he locked the door behind him, he whispered a quiet prayer for Anthony and Keisha. "I hope I'm making you proud," he said softly. "I hope this is what you would have wanted me to do." The Chicago night was cold, but Marcus felt warm, purposeful, alive in a way he hadn't felt in 20 years. He'd spent 2 decades believing that his strength made him dangerous, that his power could only hurt people, that the safest thing to do was hide. But tonight, walking through the streets toward home, Marcus understood the truth at last. Strength isn't dangerous. Ignorance is dangerous. Arrogance is dangerous. Cruelty is dangerous. But strength, wielded with wisdom and compassion, that can change the world, one student at a time. One lesson at a time. One quiet act of dignity at a time. Marcus Thompson, the silent champion, had finally found his voice. And what he had to say, through his actions, his teaching, his example, was more powerful than any punch he'd ever thrown in any ring anywhere in the world. The real fight wasn't against other fighters. It was against injustice, against cruelty, against the parts of ourselves that want to diminish others to feel bigger. And that was a fight worth coming out of retirement for. That was a fight worth winning. Remember this, friends. The next time you see someone and judge them by their job, their appearance, their position in life, remember Marcus Thompson. Remember that everyone you meet is carrying a story you know nothing about. Everyone has battles they've fought, losses they've endured, strengths they've hidden away. Respect isn't something people have to earn from you. It's something you give freely, because that's what character looks like. True strength isn't about domination. It's about control. It's about using your power to lift others up, not tear them down. And the quietest warriors are often the strongest ones. Because real power doesn't need to announce itself. It just is. Thank you for listening to this story. May it remind you to treat every person you meet with the dignity they deserve. Not because of their credentials or their titles, but simply because they're human. And that's the only credential that truly matters.